Hello, everybody. I'm Betty Bailly Torres, Chair of the American Bar Association's Commission on Hispanic Legal Rights and Responsibilities. The Hispanic Commission is very pleased to offer this webinar, the Hispanic LGBTQ community 1 year after Bostock. The webinar is co-sponsored by our friends and colleagues at the ABA Commission on Civil Rights and Social Justice, the ABA Commission on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity, the ABA Commission on Labor and Employment, the Hispanic National Bar Association, the LGBT Law Section of the State Bar of Texas, and the Hispanic Issues Section of the State Bar of Texas. You will hear from a stellar panel, which will be moderated by ABA Hispanic Commissioner Luis Lopez. Luis joined the commission in 2020. He is an attorney and seasoned executive in the federal government, where he works on matters involving civil rights, employment, discrimination, harassment, amongst other things. During his career, including as former president of the DC Hispanic Bar Association, he has advocated for increased Hispanic representation in the legal profession and public service, as well as better and more transparent protections for members of the Hispanic community. Luis, thank you, and all of the panelists. We're looking forward to this session.
Thank you, Betty, so much for those kind words and for introducing our program. I would like to introduce our esteemed panelists, the first of which is Alejandra Caraballo, who is a staff attorney at the Transgender Legal Defense and Educational Fund in New York City, where she handles all stages of impact litigation to advance the rights of the transgender community. She also was appointed as the first openly trans community board member in Brooklyn and currently serves as the Housing Committee Chair. The next panelist is Eduardo Juarez, who's a supervisory trial attorney in the San Antonio, Texas office of the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, where he litigates employment discrimination cases. He is a former president of the National LGBT Bar Association and recently received the ABA Stonewall Award for his civil rights work. Frank Martinez is Vice President of Legal Affairs at LVMH Moet Hennessy Louis Vuitton in New York City, where he provides employment law counseling and manages litigation. He previously served on the board of directors of the LGBT Law Association of Greater New York and has received awards by both HMBA and the National LGBT Bar Association. We had one other panelist, Felicia Medina, who unfortunately is not able to join us today. So we will miss her voice and her perspective, but hopefully we'll be able to have her speak on a panel in the future. So our program today is going to take an intersectional approach to talk about the Hispanic LGBTQ+ community. As some of you may know, law professor Kimberly Williams Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality back in 1989. At that time, she was specifically talking about the intersection of race and sex and how the predominant legal discrimination framework was flawed in that it treated Black women as purely Black or purely women, ignoring specific challenges they faced as Black women. Since that time, the term has been more widely used to address how overlapping identities and experiences combine to form disadvantages, discrimination, and otherwise adverse effects on marginalized communities in distinct and meaningful ways. We hope to engage in a thoughtful dialogue around these complex issues, especially as they relate to social justice and civil rights protections for the Hispanic LGBTQ+ community. We also hope that today's program will be the first of a series of intersectionality webinar programs sponsored by the Commission. So please visit the ABA's website to get more details about future programs. In terms of what we hope to cover today, we're going to start with providing some important context and share personal experiences about what it means to be at this particular intersection. Then we will turn to the Supreme Court decisions issued last year regarding the federal protections against employment discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. From there, we'll discuss the ramifications of these decisions on other program areas, as well as on some unique issues facing the Hispanic LGBTQ+ community. We'll also try to offer some best practices as we go along, and at the end, I'll give the panelists an opportunity to give some closing remarks or advice. As audience members, you can place your questions into the Q&A not the chat tab, but the Q&A tab of the Zoom platform. And we will try to address the questions as we go along, or certainly toward the end of the program. I want to say that today is particularly a great day to host this program because it is International Non-Binary Day. And so it's a day when people reflect on people in our community in any event. So having this discussion, I think, is a nice tie-in to what is celebrated internationally. So the Hispanic LGBTQ plus community is not monolithic. Indeed, we each on this panel represent distinct parts of what that intersectionality means. I thought we'd get started by having some of us share our own stories of how we experienced growing up Hispanic and either gay, bi, or trans. And I'll go first, and then I'll give my panelists an opportunity to share their stories. So I was born and raised in a large Hispanic family in Kansas City. And in addition to our amazing food and music, which I miss, my mom's cooking, we embraced a traditional sense of family and community. I'm the youngest of 9 children. I have 4 awesome older brothers and 4 sisters, and we largely adhere to traditional gender roles where men are supposed to be macho. But there were also differences. For example, we were not raised in the main Mexican neighborhood of the city where most of my tios, tias, and primos lived. And in addition to the physical distance, we also faced some linguistic barriers. Since my parents themselves had strong accents, that seemed to pose challenges in everyday life. They wanted their children to speak clearly and without accents if possible. Thus, we could mostly comprehend, but could not speak Spanish very well. While these circumstances made it easier to assimilate with our fellow non-Hispanic friends, they affected our ability to fully integrate into the local Mexican community. But even in our own communities, for example, in school, which were mainly white, we were seen as other because of our skin color or our last name, or the fact that we had immigrant parents from non-European countries. We all went to Catholic school, and the expectation was that we would be devout and chaste. And from an early age, I knew that I was different from my brothers and from my male friends. I got called names sometimes because I wasn't sufficiently macho. And growing up, I had no contact with the gay community or anyone who I knew to be gay, bi, or trans. I didn't know of any safe spaces to explore the feelings that I was having at that time. Ultimately, I felt like I had to move away from Kansas City and from my family just to clear my head, to understand what I was feeling, to get through what was the initial denial of my sexual orientation, and then find the strength over time to help me accept my true, authentic self. It also took me some time to realize that I could remain a person of strong faith. However, I chose to define my religious or spiritual belief system. And while I think that I was genuinely a happy kid and I felt loved and supported by my family, I also felt a little broken and disconnected from others because for such a long time, I purposefully hid a big part of who I am. So that's sort of one of my experience. And Frank, I think you had some overlaps in terms of some of your experience. So maybe you can start by telling us a little bit about your experience and whether you felt connected or disconnected to these communities.
Yeah, it's almost like we were living parallel lives, Louis. I have some of the facts about being the youngest, being a macho Hispanic family, not speaking Spanish. All those happened in my childhood as well for similar reasons. I've always felt that, and I felt this keenly when I was young, that I wasn't too connected to the Hispanic community, and I didn't know what the LGBTQ community was at that time because at that time, and I think it might be different now, growing up gay was a problem. And it was something that most people hid, and you didn't look out in the world and see yourself. There wasn't access. And so that part felt completely closed down. While there was also a disconnection to the Hispanic community, because for me, the language and being gay was something that I think was alienating, in part due to the sort of religious aspect of the Hispanic community. And ironically, I was the more religious one. And I think the reason for that is it was another way. I mean, as a little overachiever, it was another way to be perfect. It was to be perfect religiously. And ultimately, I ended up going to the seminary. It didn't last, but it's kind of the direction that drove me in seemed like a viable alternative to somebody who was gay, who was also religious at the time. And it seemed that obviously I was wrong in that, and that wasn't going to be my path. But I will say on the connectedness issue later in life that I think being part of being both gay and Hispanic made me feel slightly alienated from both communities. As a Hispanic person, I think I moved into circles where it seemed the predominant the people who were calling the showing up and sort of defining the community were white, and I wasn't. So I think ultimately it has a way of making you feel disconnected to any community directly. And some of that can be inspiring to find your own way, but it's also disheartening as well. So I will leave it at that.
Eduardo, or
I can go next. I struggled a lot with my Latinx identity growing up. I was an only child, and I was very much the kind of black sheep of the family. I grew up wearing skinny jeans, Vans, and playing guitar and skateboarding, and listening to hardcore and metal. And just kind of all those things that stereotypically Puerto Ricans don't do. And all my family were like, why are you acting so white all the time? And so it was just kind of those things, and it felt really, kind of contradictory, because it was it felt like from my own family that I couldn't like these things and be Latinx, because I was liking things that were stereotypically white. And it was really hard for me to kind of own that, because I would go into these spaces, I would go to shows and I would go out skateboarding and stuff, and there weren't anybody that really looked like me. So, that was a bit hard to reconcile. And so I think for a long time, I had a hard time really finding my Latinx identity. But I think it had kind of subtly been there the whole time, because, I grew up in a house full a salsa, merengue, and dancing and everything on Saturdays. Every Saturday it was a house party with family coming over and tons of food until 2 or 3 in the morning. And so when and I think for me, I didn't come out until, I graduated law school, and I didn't start my transition until right after law school. And my first job was at New York Legal Assistance Group in the LGBTQ Law Project. And most of my clients were trans Latino women that I was representing in the immigration context, because many of them were undocumented. A lot of them did survival sex work. And so, through that part, when I was going through my transition, I was reconnecting a lot with my Latinx identity, because so many of my clients were only spoke Spanish. And I was oftentimes going to meet them where they were at. I did a clinic out in Jamaica at a health clinic. And I really I reconnected with my Spanish speaking. I reconnected with a lot of the culture, and so I really reconnected. And now I feel as a kid, I was the last thing I wanted to hear was my dad playing Hector Lavoe or Gran Combo, or any of the of the salsa bands. And I was just at Fire Island, and I was blasting salsa, and I was I'm being that obnoxious Puerto Rican at the beach. But and so it's kind of weird, how when you kind of grow older, you kind of get nostalgic about those things. And so even though as a teenager and even a young adult, I kind of was I still play guitar, I still listen to metal, and I still do all these things. But I still in my heart, still have all these things very close to me. And I think part of it is also, trying to reconnect a lot and learning about, the history of Puerto Rico, and a lot of its independence leaders and stuff like that. So, I've really reconnected and tried to refine my identity really in the last few years. And it's been quite a journey.
thank you. Eduardo.
Sure. Yeah, you know what, I can identify with a lot of the experiences shared by you all. You know, part might be some generational differences. I'm at the very tail end of the baby boomer generation. And so like I grew up on the west side of San Antonio, which is a historical and still is primarily Mexican American Latino neighborhoods, barrios in kind of like close to downtown San Antonio. And so like I grew up with a very strong sense of family. I was also the youngest of 8 children, and kind of that whole traditional where my dad was a World War II veteran, came back, got married with my mom, then started a job with an Air Force base here. So his federal job allowed us to gain access to like lower middle class, and they put us all through like private schools, and everything. I mean, because San Antonio is so primarily Latino, it's like I identified completely with my culture and with being a Latino. And I mean, but then, and, you know, there were differences. I mean, when I got to high school, definitely, that's when I started realizing, hey, it's not just Latinos in the world. And I have to say though, that with regard to like my being a gay person, it was complete invisibility. I mean, first of all, it was like confusion, but it was all just very silent, kind of just kind of lonely, going through it, because I even though nobody told me, like my parents never told me, and nobody ever told me this is bad, or but you know, because in general, I don't think we never had that conversation about the birds and the bees in general, but about like people being gay was just not even discussed. So there was like a deep sense of like confusion, some loneliness really, and just feeling isolated about that part of my identity. And honestly, I didn't, you know, I think what we're going to discuss about coming out, but that didn't happen until like later in my 20s when I left to college already. You know, and like there are some like I think Lewis mentioned gender roles and things like that. I mean, my dad worked outside the house. My mom raised 8 kids, so it's not as if she didn't work. I mean, she just worked inside the house. But there was also like my parents, I feel, even though they were what I guess what's called the greatest generation, it's like they did not, they have their own views. I mean, they like my mom made like, or had like primary say in all the economic decisions, you know? And my mom kind of like was a very, I mean, I think they had a partnership where, yes, my dad was definitely, you know, a man and had his machismo about him, but when it came to like their partnership, I mean, I saw some equality in them, but in any case, I think that there was also like a religious, since I went to like a Catholic grade school and Catholic high school, there was also that angle, you know, going on, and in any case, I identified with my Latino heritage, but to me, what was lagging in terms of community growing up was a sense that I had a community in the LGBTQ plus community. I mean, it was non-existent for me. Probably one of the reasons why I didn't come out till much later.
Thank you, Eduardo, and all of you. Our discussion and in our preparation for this program reminded me of a quote by an LGBTQ plus writer and activist who said, this is his quote, "Queer people don't grow up as ourselves. We grow up playing a version of ourselves that sacrifices authenticity to minimize humiliation and prejudice. the massive task of our adult lives is to unpick which parts of ourselves are truly us and which parts we've created to protect us. And I think that resonated with me because I believe as LGBTQ plus Hispanics, this task is even more daunting. To figure out our true authentic selves, many of us spend years examining not just our sexual orientation and gender identity, but also our Hispanic identities. For example, whether we were hiding parts of our culture to better assimilate, whether we should try and speak better Spanish or better English, or simply be content with, or at least not feel bad about whatever language skills we have. And the list could go on. And that is what intersectionality is about and why it's so important for us to better understand it. We sort of have alluded to coming out, and while we don't typically come out as Hispanics, the process of coming out has often been a seminal part of the LGBTQ plus experience. And so we sort of have touched around the edges of this, but I'd like to spend some time talking about our own coming out stories and whether our Hispanic identity specifically played any role in that process. And again, I'll get the ball rolling, and then this will be the last time I get the ball rolling, but certainly we'll have a good discussion about this. For me, the coming out process was exhausting, in large part because my family, like many traditional Hispanic families, are just so big. And there's an expression in Spanish that says, "Lo que se ve no se pregunta," and you've heard this already being discussed in terms of the visibility around this. And that translates into English as what you see, you don't ask. And many gay Hispanic artists like Walter Mercado or Juan Gabriel expressed non-traditional gender roles their entire lives, but never officially came out and remain accepted and cherished by the Hispanic community. I think for a long time, I was in a similar don't ask, don't tell type status. I later learned that I had family members and longtime family friends who were gay, had moved away from home, and were in committed long-term relationships with their partners, yet everyone still referred to them as roommates. And so this idea that it's just best to ignore these discussions that are obvious or that people don't want to have, just to keep the peace. Eventually, while I was in law school, I told a few friends I was gay. Then I moved on to my family. I started with one sibling, and then I told another. And their reactions were mixed. They were very supportive and loving of me, but also worried and protective. For example, wanting me to talk to their priest or discouraging me from telling my parents or others for fear that I might get hurt or bullied. But these discussions really served as critically important to me in my process to make me stronger in who I am. And I also recognized that it was also a process for the people I was telling, including my family and my friends, to better understand the side of me that I had hid from the world. And eventually I worked up the nerve to tell my parents, and that was probably one of the most daunting things that I felt like I had to do. And I did it when they were visiting me in DC, and I thought very strategically, the way I tend to do about certain things is I wanted to be on my home turf because it was important that in case things didn't go well, I could have the support of my friends. Like many of us, I think that I was also an overachiever. And I was a good kid. I was obedient. I got good grades. And looking back on it now, I think that I was trying to rack up the cool points to make my family proud of me, because when they found out that I was gay, it would change and that they would stop loving and supporting me. And for years, my mom had asked me about my life and questions the way a mother does, wanting to get to know their children as they get older. And I was growing more distant. And I was building walls to protect me, or maybe to protect her, or maybe both of us, I'm not even sure. But in doing so, I was only hurting us in our relationship. So when I finally did tell my parents, I was so relieved that their immediate reaction was love. My mother wanted to learn more. She asked a lot of questions, but she only asked them at a comfortable pace that she could handle the answers. She told me that she too was afraid that I was going to stop loving her if she asked me the wrong questions or made a mistake. And that completely blew my mind. And her vulnerability and willingness to learn just brought us closer together. My father was also a rock star in this respect. And while we never directly talked about my being gay, and that could be because of the macho mentality or other reasons, but he went out of his way regularly to let me know how much he loved me and that he was so proud of the man that I had become. And we had some very tender moments together before he passed away a few years ago. And I'm so grateful for those. Um, I told the rest of my family, who, like my dad, didn't ask a whole lot of questions, but were always super supportive. And like I said, just because of the family being so big, it was just a long process that took a lot of effort and energy. And so that's my story. Alejandra, I remember when we talked, you had an interesting story about when you told your family. So maybe you could share that with us.
Yeah. So I came out to myself 2 weeks after the bar exam. I have this tired joke where I always say the bar exam was so hard it made me a woman. Um, but you know, so I came out to myself in August, and I was still didn't have a job. And I managed to get a position at New York Legal Assistance Group as a fellow. Uh, um, uh, within the LGBTQ law project, and I kind of had everything stabilized, and I was starting the process of my transition, and I was like realizing, okay, I need to tell my parents, because I think I don't know if they had questioned anything, because at the time I was engaged to my fiance of 7 years, and I was living with her, and she had really supported me through law school, and I don't think my parents ever questioned I was queer, but I think they were wondering like, yeah, I don't know. I never saw you working in LGBTQ law project. Okay. And, and then so that December, I decided I needed to tell them. And so I wrote a letter. Um, and I remember just absolutely shaking and trembling when I hit send. And I just told my mom, I was like, hey, I'm sending you a letter. Like, call me after you get a chance to read it if you want to talk. And I think there was a little bit of like, they felt it was out of left field, and um, but there was real acceptance. I think there was a lot of shock at first, um, but my parents have been super accepting and super supportive of me since, and they immediately just wanted me to come home for the holidays that year and like really see what was going on. And that was actually the last time I was ever like in boy mode, like before I went like completely 100, because I'd already been full-time at work and in my transition, but it was weird going back to Florida, especially in the aftermath of Trump being elected. It was like, felt like the worst time to come out as trans. And so and I really had, for me, it was kind of interesting because my parents were so accepting. My mom took me shopping for clothes, and she gave me one of her purses and all this stuff. And my ex-fiance ended up actually breaking up with me and pushing me out of the apartment. And so like the person who I thought was going to be there for me wasn't. And the people I was most afraid of, you know, uh, uh, removing me from their life, my parents, like, turned out not to be the case. And both my grandparents were also very supportive, and my grandmother's super religious. She's a Catholic, goes to church every Sunday and is part of the choir and everything. But even she was just like, God doesn't make mistakes, and he made you exactly the way you are, and then that's who you are. And so, I love you all the same. And I was just like in absolute tears when she told me that. And so it was a lot. And I reflect back like on kind of that fear, because my parents weren't outright like, they were never homophobic or anything like that growing up, but there was a lot of homophobia in my extended family, because I did have queer cousins. And then there were like kind of comments my parents would make, and there, especially if my gay cousin would bring his boyfriend around to family gatherings, or like, oh, I don't really care, but like, does he have to be so like in our face like this? And growing up, you kind of start to internalize that, and just a lot of the casual like homophobic slurs that are used, not um and so just kind of dealing with all those things and internalizing it, not really realizing it. Maybe that having that kind of internalized homophobia, and having a difficulty you know, really accepting, you know, who I was. And, you know, and so, you know, in my extended family, my grandmother would immediately tell me, she's just like, yeah, oh, I have this cousin that like Rosa, who like everybody knew, like we just, nobody talked about it. It was just like, she lived with her, like I think you said earlier, with her roommate. And like, because everybody was close knit family, everybody, you know, would be like, okay, we just don't talk about it, but like they're just another member of the family. And it was just always kind of interesting how they, you know, handled it back then. It wasn't like, you know, it was just like it was, again, I think you framed it perfectly as don't ask, don't tell. And you know, and so what was the most difficult thing for me as like 6 months after that, I came out to my parents, like during that time, my grandfather had gotten pancreatic cancer and unfortunately passed away actually 4 years ago this week. And I eulogized my grandfather, and I did so in a dress and in the Catholic Church. I would joke, I was like, I'm surprised I didn't, you know, with all the stuff from religion, I was like, you know, I'm surprised I didn't just go up in flames as I stepped foot in there. Uh, but you know, it was like all my extended family that had not seen me, right, in years, and a lot of them probably didn't necessarily know I had come out, or they had maybe heard rumors or had heard, you know, bochinche, that like I had come out as trans. And, you know, but then I was there, like in front of everybody in a dress, like eulogizing my grandfather in Spanish. And it was just like, it was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. You know, getting the courage to go up in front of all my family and like knowing and getting all those looks and like everybody kind of whispering to themselves, like I could see it. And I was just like, oh my God, what am I doing? And I just stared right out, like didn't make eye contact. I'd like, you know, looked over everybody's heads. But you know, I would say a lot of my family was actually very, very accepting. And so, um, you know, with the exception of some extended family on my dad's side, who I think my aunt called my dad and was like asking if he was suicidal because I came out as trans, because that is like, I guess in my aunt's eyes, that was like literally the worst possible thing that could happen. And, you know, and it just is like, I can't even fathom thinking that, but it's just ridiculous. But you know, I've been very, very blessed and very fortunate that my family has been very supportive and very close. And I'm an only child, so you know, I think that might have played into it as well. Like I'm literally, you know, um, my parents' only kid, so it was a lot in coming out. So
Thank you, Alejandra, for sharing that with us. Frank or Eduardo?
I'll go next. I wanted to just make a comment about I think on chat, there was like a question about San Antonio having such a thriving LGBTQ plus Latino community. And it's true, I think. But I left at 18, so I felt like it wasn't accessible to me before I left. But now it's nice to be part of LULAC Orgullo, which is a local, you know, Latinx LGBTQ organization, and the Esperanza Peace and Justice Center and other organizations that are awesome here in San Antonio. But you know what, I like my coming out experience kind of, to me, brings out, and I completely feel that there are definite challenges that are external. There's definite discrimination, outright violence against our community. But there's also the internal voices, like my own kind of internal challenges about coming out, that and where because like for me, I just stayed, like, really, I didn't want to come out. It's just like it was a lot of fear. And so like I have like three stories I wanted to share, but one is like with regard to like my job. I was working at the Public Defender Service in Washington, D.C. at the time. You know what, I was in my late 20s. And so I was not out at work. and there was a colleague. So we had like one of those kind of gatherings that are somewhat professional, but also a little more laid back because it was after hours, but it was definitely kind of work related. And people were sharing kind of like amongst a group of us. And one of my colleagues, who I respected very much, well, there was a comment made that was kind of like an anti-gay comment. Someone made some kind of joke. I even forget what it was, but one of my colleagues, who I respect very much, stood up and said, you know, I wanted to share with you all that my father died of AIDS, and that he was a gay man, and that I don't appreciate those the comments that are anti-gay. And I just like I was I took that. I said, you know what, it's now or never. When I heard my colleague have that courage to say that about his father, I said, you know what, this is the time. And I took that opportunity, and I said, well, I also wanted to share something, and that I'm gay. And so it was quite an experience. I mean, you know, back then. So that started like kind of like my coming out process professionally or at work. And so like, but in terms of like family, which to me is probably the most important coming out, is that and by the way, I think that story about like my colleague shows the importance of allies and how they can be supportive even to us. I mean, and it's a vice versa kind of thing. But with my mom, like my mom, I was also in kind of like my late 20s at the time, and I was living in DC, working, you know, as a lawyer already, and I was visiting them in San Antonio. And I just recall my mother, we were sitting in the living room, and my mother started talking to me about a cousin of mine whose name is Eddie. Actually, that's kind of like my name too. My family would call me Eddie. And she said, you know what? Eddie's sister called me and told me that Eddie was gay, and that she's very distraught about it. And she's like, you know, and she called me to get advice from me. And my mother told me that she told, you know, my cousin Eddie's sister that, you know, that's your brother. You should love him, and you know, no matter what. And so like my mother was telling me this, and then she looked at me and she said, don't you have something to tell me? And so like it was like so that my mother was in effect kind of like telling me, it's okay, you can tell me, you know what, don't worry, we're still gonna love you and accept you. So so you know, that's what kind of nudged me then to come out to her. And so and you know, I think the fathers are maybe for some reason or another the hardest to talk to, and sometimes, and I totally think that, you know, it's okay. Ultimately, you know, actions speak louder than words, right? I mean, and so how they accept you and love you is to me the important thing. And I also like want to say that I realized maybe our experiences are kind of more positive, and I know that I've heard from so many people how that there are a lot of really bad negative experiences in terms of coming out to parents. But with my dad, I actually had, it was later, God, maybe even like 10 years after my mom and I had the conversation. Of course, my dad already knew, because if the mother knows, the dad knows. I mean, and so I had been going actually to I had been getting therapy, right? I mean, just for mental health issues, you know, I mean, just like and so, you know, through that process, I kind of got encouragement and the idea that I would like to talk to my dad. And then I did one afternoon. He would, and what I told him was that I said, you know what, you taught me to be proud of who I am. You raised me to be the person that I am. And I don't want for me not that I don't want it to seem as if that I didn't say anything because I feel ashamed of who I am. So I told him, that I'm gay. And it was pretty much, not, he said, he pretty much said, that it was okay. I mean, you know what, that there was no big issue. And, but it was more me that I felt like the necessity to tell him and to have that conversation with him, because I didn't want him to think that, I'm ashamed, and I think that it was maybe more for my benefit than anything else. Because he already knew, and he didn't, he accepted me and respected me. And anyway, those were my kind of coming out experiences.
I will say that I think sometimes the context of the family matters in the circumstances. I hear some of your stories and I think that was different in my family. And just to set it up, I mean, we talked about sort of the alienation from communities, and I wanted to add one more layer on top of that because it's quite common, especially in first or second generation Mexican American, for there to be economic problems as well. And then that was certainly true in my house. We were very poor, to the point of getting help from the local community church for food and that sort of thing. And sorry to say, alcohol abuse can play into this as well. And all those layers can tend to really make the coming out story or the challenges that someone who's gay in the family will have in coming out. And for me, I added to that the religious aspect of it, which, as I said before, I sort of turned myself into this religious zealot. So I was having fights in my head during high school with God about this. I mean, it was negotiations, it was prayers, it was tears, it was, what do I need to do? I've been a good son, all of this. I mean, that was going on for years. So the fight was going on in my head, even if my family wasn't really ultra religious. And then there were fights going on with the family, and then, about money, about everything, So, after I graduated from high school, and by the way, I grew up in a situation where there were constant remarks about feminine men and sissies. My brother was terrible. The people I went to high school with were terrible, and I was not the most, macho kid. Let's just be honest here. I wasn't. So I was the target of much bullying all through grade school and in high school. And I think my way of combating that was to become smarter, to get better grades, to do everything, to be a student body president, and show you that I could be Mr. Superman, and even if you think I'm less than. And by the time I turned 18, I was just angry at the world because I realized that I was in this constant fight. And I took that to seminary where I studied, and that's where I had my first experiences. And so you can imagine the fights I'm going through in my head, going to confession after some experience and then deciding I'm never going to do that again. And just, anyway, it was exhausting. The year later, I think the exhaustion had reached the limit, and I had decided it was that music was my field of chosen direction. I had enrolled in music school, and the wonderful thing about having done that was I was now around a group of people where this was much more openly accepted in music school, right? So I found a community in music school where I could now safely, or at least feel confident coming back at 19 and coming out to my parents. Different reactions. My mother did the whole Mexican lamenting, I wasn't a good enough mother, something's wrong with me, that you came out this way. I kind of let her play that role a bit, and then just, I really didn't have time for it. And I kind of told her that. I said, it's interesting to me how in some of these stories, or at least for mine, how people made it about them. Your coming out was, how could you do that to me? Why didn't you trust me? Right? It's astounding to me how straight people will turn this to be about them and their feelings, never thinking for a minute what we have been through, especially growing up when we did and how we did. So I had little patience for that kind of reaction, including my mother, who was the overall just like my father, we're gonna love you no matter what. I will say that that's what my mother said. It took her some years to really get comfortable talking about it. I think it was maybe 10 years later that she really admitted to herself that I might be actually having sex with men. So that was a big leap for her. Like, you know, she couldn't imagine that would be happening. My father immediately, I told him, they both said they knew already. My father confessed that the reason he was so tough on me, and he was tough on me, was because he wanted to protect me. He wanted to, in his version of making me tough, so that I would be stronger in the world, which I can see, you know, but I appreciated his immediate grasp of the situation, without hesitancy. It didn't matter to him. Neither of my parents were ultra religious. And even if, I think for them, their family came before their religion in that way. And they didn't have any problem saying that. You know, I was the one having the religious problem. I was the one who had to learn, what am I going to do with this in a faith that teaches me that this is wrong? And ultimately, you know, different from Lewis, I moved away from the church. I spent time thinking about the issue, and I ultimately decided I don't want to be part of a club that doesn't want me. And either they're wrong or I'm wrong, and I'm not wrong because this wasn't a choice. So I left the church, ultimately left Christianity, and moved towards agnosticism and atheism. And that's, you know, that's kind of where I am today. I'm not religious at all, but I mean, that was among a few other problems I had with the Catholic Church. That's ultimately one of the things that drove me out of the church, was the view on homosexuality. But I would say, you know, after that, being in music school for the next 10, 12 years it was easier. And, you know, I became very comfortable with myself during the college year.
Thanks, Frank. So in addition to being a member of the Hispanic LGBTQ plus community, we're all lawyers as well. And as lawyers, which I believe is probably the bulk of our audience, we're taught about the importance of legal rights and responsibilities. And as Hispanics and members of the LGBTQ plus community, we sometimes experience bias and discrimination, things that we've acknowledged already, at work or out in public or in our daily lives. And so I want to ask the panelists if they've had to confront these types of violations or attacks on identity, either for themselves or in their practice, maybe even representing clients. And I know all of us have done that in various different respects. And so how you confronted those, and so maybe Eduardo, I'll ask you to sort of kick us off on this one.
Sure. I have to say that you know, I mean, it could have happened. I just didn't know about it, you know, for me, like personally, but I just through serendipity, I felt like after I started off at a big law firm, Sidley Austin, and then I went to PDS in DC, and then I came to San Antonio, and I've been working at the EEOC since 2001. And pretty early, like starting in about 2004, I started looking at the case law on developing Title VII, which I think we're going to talk about Bostock. But I mean, the early starts, I mean, it goes a long way even before this time. But about the case law developing Title VII to include discrimination against you know, people who are transgender or LGBTQ plus, yeah. That's kind of like the way I kind of worked in as a lawyer, that aspect. I mean, in 2004, there was a trans woman who was a certified nurse's aide who was told, you know, by an owner that of a company that she needed to dress her gender or go home. And then we got testimony that said the reason she was fired, and this was an affidavit. I mean, and it was like saying that she was fired because she had too high a voice, like high pitched voice, falsetto voice, that she was mincing, which means acting daintily, and that she, you know, and that she wasn't addressing her gender. So at that time, you know, we were kind of following the Smith versus City of Salem kind of case in the Sixth Circuit dealing with gender stereotyping. That was a transgender firefighter. And you know, my office, the EOC San Antonio office back in 2004 found cause on that case. We found cause based on that it was sex discrimination under Title VII, and was based on, you know, that theory. So, you know, that's just a short story to say that you know, what I've been, that it's important for us to be in the positions that we are, whatever it is that we're doing, because we can then try to work to try to advance the issues that are important to us, and especially in the question that you asked, Louis, about discrimination against people based on LGBTQ+ status. You know.
Yeah, I agree with you, Eduardo, that it's important being in the positions that we are. And I also am fortunate in that I started working at a time where these issues were much more accepted, even if I wasn't quite ready to tell my coworkers. And I do think there is some, maybe not discrimination on the LGBT side. I started working at a time where you actually had to think carefully about when you came out and how and to whom, and also, you know, just the fact that we would tend to keep things more private, I think may have had effects that we don't know about, that you know, keep us out of the main fray of the people getting together for drinks after work and talking about their personal lives. I always notice my straight colleagues immediately talking about their wives or husbands, and you know, I wasn't so quick to share details of my personal life, and so I just wonder about the impact of that over a long term in a job, you know. And then, you know, from being Hispanic, I moved into a corporate area where I was often the only person of any color, certainly the only Hispanic in the room many times. And that felt a little alienating. And I think that there is some sense that, you know, and we see now with the push for diversity and inclusion that it has taken on a new resonance now. You know, we learned from the past that if you don't see people in these positions, you don't imagine them in the position. So it just sort of colors your choice about, you know, moving people into promoting people into positions of authority. But there are two things in my professional practice that I really felt being part of this community helped me, and that is, I mean, one, you know, I as an in-house counsel and having trained thousands of employees, I could speak firsthand from these days about how important it is to me, and that I think says something when you're the trainer standing up on behalf of the company is somebody who is Hispanic and gay, and is open about it, and believes in these laws in a way, and you know, makes representations on behalf of the company that this thing's important to the company as well. And for 10 years, I had my own private practice where I represented plaintiffs. And in that practice, I was fortunate enough to represent gay and lesbian discrimination issues, HIV discrimination issues, and that felt good. That is something, you know, when you are able to talk to a client and you have that in common with them and you know the language they're speaking, and it really helps your case too. It helps you prepare your case in a way that you might not be able to prepare it if you weren't. You have a sense of what this client is talking about and what they've experienced. And so, I found that very empowering.
Alejandro, did you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I think for me, I've been very fortunate, where when I transitioned at NILAG, I really didn't encounter any particular issues. I mean, I did have a occasional one or two minor issues with two coworkers, but I think they're really minor in the grand scheme of things. And so I think overall I was very, very fortunate. But I think for me as an attorney, one of the things that I struggled with the most was um, this anxiety or fear of my identity affecting my clients' cases. Um, I think even more so as a trans person, because my identity is so much more visible, um, especially to judges and others. And so I'd always, kind of be a little bit anxious about it. And I just, realized that I needed to just kind of stop fearing that and just be the best advocate I could. And so, ultimately, I never really experienced many issues, even in the courtroom when I was doing a lot of practice in civil court to get name changes for my clients, or in family court. But what I did see a lot of was discrimination against my clients. Sometimes it was just so blatant. There was one time in civil court, I was appearing in front of a Supreme Court or a former Supreme Court judge, because here in New York, the court of original jurisdiction is the Supreme Court, um, and she had already been demoted because of inappropriate outbursts in the courtroom, and she was sitting in the civil court over the name changes, and I had two white passing Latinx clients get their name change and get their publication waiver. So usually for a name change, you have to publish your name change. And oftentimes one of the reasons we represent trans people in court is to be able to get a waiver for that publication. And then my third client, who was Afro-Latinx, for whatever reason, the judge was like, oh, I was just informed that we can strike the address, but we can still have them published. And I was like, but you waived publication for my other two clients. And like, this client is in a shelter, you can't publish their address. And I'm like, well, we can just strike off the address. And I was like, but I don't understand. You waived publication from my other two clients. And it just seemed very, very blatant. Like she just was prejudicial against my client, who was visibly a Black. Like, and I kept pushing back and pushing back. And finally, at one point, she was like, you're being contemptuous. And and I didn't raise my voice at all. I was just being, trying to push back. And, towards the end, I realized that it was just, she was an immovable object and she was not going to change her stance. So I decided, okay, well, I'll figure this out. We can refile and hopefully come in front of another judge. We can figure something out. And when I was walking out of the courtroom, she, this was a fairly big courtroom too. She yelled across the entirety of the courtroom and was like, and I don't appreciate your righteous indignation. And, and being called contemptuous, I think like being bordering on contempt in a courtroom, I think that's one of the things as attorneys, we're like, that's like the area you don't want to be in. But I think that moment I was like, I was proud of the advocacy I did, even though it ultimately was not fruitful, because I still fought for my client in a respectful manner, even if the judge was being outright, I'll say prejudicial and biased against my client. And then another case that was my last case at NILAG that I lost, and I had trouble sleeping for weeks after this case, where it involved a custody dispute over a child between a lesbian couple. The judge or the referee in that case, like, completely bought they were just friends defense by the bio mom. And it was just so asinine to me that, we had it on the record that they were sharing a bed, were engaged, like they have all these pictures at like vacationing at various places, like all these things and all this facts on the record. And they were like, and it was like, there was no intimate relationship. It was just, and it just seemed very much like the judge was very, this was a very notorious judge in the family court there, but it just very biased against LGBTQ people. And just seeing that kind of blatant bias against my clients, it's really hard to reconcile, especially in a place like New York City. Like, this place is supposed to be really friendly for LGBTQ people. and you end up going in front of judges that just have this exceptional bias towards our clients, either on race or sex or transgender status or LGBTQ status overall. And, you know, it's really hard because, like, you know, whatever, if I get misgendered in court, like, you know, yes, I'm upset, but like ultimately, like, I'll hold my tongue. But if a judge misgenders my client or something like that, like, I will speak up because for me, it's about, you know, representing my clients and putting them first. And so I think that's where I've always had a difficult time in the profession, is just like balancing that need to put my clients first and represent them. But also, you know, how much this affects me, like, you know, as a member of the LGBTQ community, when I see direct bias against them. Yeah, and how it affects ultimately their lives.
Thank you to all of you for your brave stories about your own experience, as well as the discussion we've been having about some of the people that we've represented. And I think this is a great time to sort of shift gears a little bit and move on to the Supreme Court's seminal decisions from last summer. As most of you, I'm sure, know, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 has long banned discrimination based on sex, as well as based on national origin, which includes being Hispanic, and could include discrimination based on language or accent or other related characteristics. Last June, the Supreme Court decided a trio of cases involving LGBTQ plus workers, Bostock versus Clayton County, Altitude Express versus Zarda, and RG and GR Harris Funeral Homes versus EEOC. In these cases, which we collectively refer to as Bostock, the court issued an historic decision holding that Title VII prohibits workplace discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Writing for the majority, Justice Gorsuch framed the decision as a, quote, straightforward application of legal terms with plain and settled meanings. The court concluded that, quote, it is impossible to discriminate against a person for being homosexual or transgender without discriminating against that individual based on sex. So that was a historic decision for a number of reasons. And I know Eduardo and I were fortunate enough to attend the oral arguments in the case, and that the cases were impactful for folks for a number of different reasons, but they also left some important issues unresolved and did not address adequately certain segments or issues within our community. And so I want to ask about the impact of this case just generally, as well as the impact on federal and state and local laws. And so, Eduardo, maybe I'll start with you, given your role at EEOC and with primary enforcement of Title VII, and Title VII now providing clear federal workplace protections for LGBTQ plus individuals. Has EEOC issued any new guidance since these decisions? And is some of the pre-Bostock guidance also still relevant? I think you're on mute.
Sorry. Yeah, the EEOC has issued some recent guidance. It was issued on June 15th, which I believe was the anniversary of the actual decision, but it's called Protections Against Employment Discrimination Based on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity. It is a technical assistance document. And so, you know, if you're interested, you can find it. You know, it's public, but I do think that it's like a very important, it's an important decision on so many different aspects. I mean, it provides nationwide protection in the employment arena for people based on LGBTQ status. You know, for places like, I mean, some states already have them in their state laws, but there were plenty of states like Texas that didn't. And so now it applies to, you know, the entire nation. I think that the other thing is that in the like dissenting opinion, Justice Alito points out that it's going to affect other federal laws that also prohibit sex discrimination. In other words, that, you know, that the interpretation of Title VII is going to be taken as a model to interpret other federal laws that prohibit sex discrimination. He cited 100 different, laws. So, I mean, I think Court Justice Alito saw that as a negative, but you can also see that as in the other way and say, wow, it has an impact not only in the employment arena, but in all the other arenas as well: consumer protection, housing, you name it, where there's like a federal law prohibit in Title IX, which is education. So that's another reason why it's important. I would say that with regard to the EEOC guidance, one thing that the guidance sets forth is it doesn't set forth anything new. It just kind of explains the Bostock decision, but it also explains the pre-Bostock decisions that the EEOC had set forth, like the decision. There's one, Macy, that said that pre-Bostock, the EEOC had held that discrimination based on gender identity is sex discrimination. And then also the Baldwin decision, which the EEOC held there, that discrimination based on sexual orientation is also sex discrimination. And I think that what's an important takeaway is that even though the Supreme Court decision was narrowly focused on textualism, that argument, the arguments about that use gender stereotyping, for example, or there's another argument that deals with association evidence, kind of like comparing it to the race discrimination case dealing with association. Those are all still valid theories, valid ways of kind of like going forth and proving sex discrimination in the LGBTQ arena. So yeah, because the Sixth Circuit decision, for example, that against the Harris Funeral Home, the Amy Stevens versus Harris Funeral Homes, that still validates the gender stereotyping as a way to prove sex discrimination. So yeah, all those the pre-Bostock decisions by the EEOC are still good decisions.
Thank you, Eduardo. I think you mentioned a lot of good things, and I want to jump off on a couple of those. One of them is, even before Bostock, many employers and businesses had already taken affirmative steps to address sexual orientation and gender identity issues in the workplace. And Frank, I'm going to ask you if you can share with us any best practices that you've seen employed before or since the Bostock decision has been issued.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on what Eduardo said about, the case history and how this sort of played in the decisions companies made. But, my feeling about, and we talked about this earlier, Lewis, about Bostock, is that for most large, sophisticated corporations, this didn't really change the way they were practicing. And, on a personal level, I have been doing employment law for a while now, and I've always thought the rationale was there. It's just that someone had to say it and understand it. I mean, there really was no other analysis. If you fire a man for dating a man, but you don't fire a woman for dating a man, how is that not sex discrimination? It's just taken, it seems that it's taken, the change in public attitudes and years of other advances in other areas for the court to finally catch up in Title VII to what was reality. Never mind all the sort of opportunities Congress had to adjust the law, which they didn't. This was always the language of Title VII, and the analysis was always there. And on those sex stereotyping cases, I mentioned before the Hopkins versus Price Waterhouse, which was basically an early case that held that discrimination based on nonconformity with gender stereotypes is discrimination based on sex. I'm not sure why we just didn't close the issue right then and there. Firing a man for dating a man is nonconformity with a gender stereotype, 100%. And if you look at the facts of Hopkins and you read about the description of Hopkins herself, it always sort of surprises me about what was lying beneath these cases. Of course, the plaintiff's attorneys in those days had to take very care about how they framed their case. And we're trying to do so straightforward under sex discrimination, and that's where we led to this new theory of sex stereotyping. And so later plaintiffs' attorneys use that. But now nobody has to go through all these analytical gymnastics because of this finding. It's just straightforward sex discrimination. I just think it's just a win for just straightforward common sense. To that end, a lot of states and cities had arrived at the conclusion years before that gender identity and expression and sexual orientation discrimination were and should be illegal. And no surprise that it happened in blue states and in big cities, which is where many, often you have major corporations have employees or satellites or headquarter offices. So that combined with a sort of public acceptance on television and in the media led corporations to sort of lead the way and sort of saying, look, this is for us on par with race discrimination and religious and disability discrimination, and develop policies to that effect. And that also, made administration easier, because you could imagine with the patchwork of state laws, it's a nightmare for any corporation to try to have a consistent policy across different jurisdictions. My group itself is employees in all but 2 of the 48 states. And so, it would make no sense to follow the protected classes of each state. And it's also the wrong thing to do. So for me, as working in the last 20 years for companies, this has been the approach. So for us, the Bostock decision was not a change in the way we did business. It didn't register a blip at the company I work for now, because it's part of our policies in Texas and in California, and we wouldn't treat it any differently. Although this made me think of the case, Louis, of what would have happened if I got a sexual orientation discrimination case in Texas brought by an employee. And yes, we would have our policy, which we rely on, but if that employee sued the company on their behalf, I, as the defense counsel, would be in the unenviable position of having to promote the position in court that sexual orientation discrimination is not covered by federal law before Bostock. And that would have been a terrible position, because it would have balanced my own personal beliefs with my duty as an attorney to zealously represent my client. So I'm glad I didn't have to deal with that issue. And like I said, no major change in the way we do business as a result of this decision.
Yeah, thank you, Frank, because that is, I think, a clarifying point that we've talked about before, particularly with Eduardo being in Texas, is not having any state protections there. This clear federal protection did make a big difference for people. And we know there are a lot of Hispanics who live in Texas, as well as in New York and California, where some of these protections have existed. The other thing that Eduardo sort of talked about was the effect that this holding could have on other areas like Title IX and education and healthcare and other issues. And so, Alejandra, do you see sort of a need for greater protections or support for the Hispanic LGBT community, and how those expanded protections could provide some of this much needed assistance?
Yeah, I think, my experience prior to my work at TILDF, I worked at New York Legal Assistance Group, primarily representing undocumented trans Latina women. And New York City has had gender identity protections for quite a while, and New York State as well. And so, we already had those protections, and yet there were still so many clear-cut cases of discrimination that would occur. And then when you're dealing at the intersection of transgender status and being undocumented and not being able to legally work, and all of these things that come into play with that, it's very difficult. And so oftentimes these protections don't really necessarily mean much for the most marginalized members of the LGBTQ community, particularly those in the Latinx community, because they don't have the luxury of, even if they file a complaint with the Commission on Human Rights here in New York City, or the Division of Human Rights with the state, or EEOC, for that matter, you know, it could take a year before there's a finding of probable cause or before there's any kind of real action at an administrative level. And when you're already at that kind of marginal end of society, you really just have to focus on survival, and you can't wait on potentially, you know. And I think there's a broader issue with the way discrimination laws is done in general, because it's very hard to prove emotional damages, and most of it is based off of lost wages. And there's the duty to mitigate by finding a new job. And so oftentimes, you know, my clients would, you know, even if they had a valid discrimination claim, the amount of money that they could get would be very minimal. And it's not necessarily worth the private bar's time to fight a case that maybe gets like $3,000 or $4,000 in lost wages, even if they were fired directly for being trans and they were able to prove everything. And they might get that a year or 2 years from now. So, you know, I think it's a broader issue with how the structure around discrimination claims are brought and litigated, and how typically friendly they are to employers. And I think that necessarily, you know, limits the protections for people who are the most marginalized. And so, you know, I think there needs to be a broader conversation about how do we make anti-discrimination laws actually have teeth and actually, you know, properly compensate employees who have been discriminated against. Because oftentimes, like, you know, I was working in a nonprofit, and you know, I didn't necessarily have to worry about, okay, are we going to get, you know, a certain amount back, and is this a viable case? It was more of like, you know, do we have a viable discrimination claim, and can we bring it? But oftentimes, you know, people would face discrimination within the workplace, but it didn't rise to the level of where they lost their job, and so there wouldn't really be an issue of damages. And so it's really hard for them, and they can't afford an attorney to help, you know, them manage, you know, internal workplace. And it's basically, you know, call us back when, you know, if they've done anything like terminate you or fire you. And so from like an on the ground perspective, it's really, really hard to say that these policies, you know, or the change in the law really affects the people who are the most marginalized. And I think for a lot of big companies, I think, you know, obviously they're going to change their policies and really crack down on discrimination. But, you know, these like small little employers, you know, restaurants, particularly in food service industry, that, you know, they maybe employ 10, 12 people. And there's just, you know, there's so much transience in the number of people working there, how long they work there, and there's a lot of people coming in and out. It's really, really hard to enforce these things. And so, you know, I think there needs to be a broader conversation about how we do make discrimination protections more protective and help those that need it the most.
I think that's really important. And I'm glad that you also touched on immigration and undocumented workers, because I've read estimates that there are upwards of 1 million LGBTQ plus adult immigrants in America. And according to one report, about 30% are undocumented, and more than 70% of those undocumented immigrants are Hispanic. And this data is hard to gather because of the fears and risks associated with coming out, deportation, and further marginalization. And, you know, I think, you know, looking at our legal system and access to justice issues is critically important for the Hispanic LGBTQ community. And while some of them may not be able to avail themselves, hopefully some are available to avail themselves of the federal or state protections against sexual orientation and gender identity. And Eduardo, I wanted you to just briefly explain what the EEO process may look like for one of them, and whether, most importantly, whether one's immigration status is a factor during the EEO process.
Sure. I just wanted to also say that what Alejandra just said, I think, is so super important. I mean, and I mean, nothing that I say in this presentation is taken as an official EEOC, you know, policy or anything, but so especially this following statement, but the caps on damages in that, you know, were passed in legislation that is 30 years old. I mean, it is definitely time to, you know, update those. So, but with regard to like immigrants, or especially undocumented immigrants, I mean, mainly we can still sue on behalf of them, and the damages are limited though. You cannot get back pay. In general, you can't get back pay unless they've already worked that work. But so the damages, it has to do with damages, but even bigger than that, I think that at least what I've experienced is that there's a tremendous amount of challenges that undocumented workers face. I mean, there's fear. There are, defense practices in litigation that go towards trying to discover issues that are kind of not related to the merits of the case, but more related to truly try to scare them. And so there's a lot of issues, and there's issues about, like, especially since I work for the EEOC, there's issues about undocumented workers even wanting to come to try to seek help from a federal, from a government agency. I mean, I think they usually feel more, in general, more comfortable coming to like kind of grassroots immigrants' rights organizations, and so I think that there needs to be a connection there between some of the federal agencies and these grassroots organizations to try to get, to try to enforce the rights for immigrant workers. But yeah, so I think that's the comment that I had for that part of it.
Thank you. So we are nearing the end of the program. We have a few minutes left, and I want to turn our gaze toward the future. And as some of you may know, Congress and the administration are looking at efforts to provide greater and clearer protections for LGBTQ+ individuals. And I think that, immigration reform is also on the horizon, and that certainly will have an impact on the Hispanic community in the United States. So I want to throw out two forward-looking questions of the panelists, and feel free to answer one or both of them. And I think we've already sort of started down this path. The first question is, what can the legal profession do to better educate, support, or assist Hispanic members of the LGBTQ+ community? And the second question is, what advice would you give to the next or the new generation of Hispanic LGBTQ+ individuals? So maybe I'll start with you, Alejandra.
Yeah, wow, it's quite a question. I think for me, I'm probably on a radical limb with this, but I think like we really need to rethink a lot of the ways that we do worker protections in this country in general. And so I know there's it's harder just to particularize just to the Latinx community, but I think these things are so, like when you're talking about intersectionalities and the ways that disparate impacts happen among the Latinx community, like we really need to look at the systemic problems and the systemic issues. And, so many of the things, the harms that come particularly to undocumented folks come from the fact that we have this system where you have to be a legal, so-called, quote unquote, legal immigrant to be able to work legally. And that is actually not that's a very recent development within the last few decades. Like, historically, for the most of the history of this country, you didn't need immigration documents to work legally in the United States. That was very much a modern invention. And so I'd love to see kind of the removal of the requirements of I-9s to hire people. I don't think you need to show that you're a US citizen. I think there's a human right to be able to work. And beyond that, I think, shifting things to a more worker-centric approach around economic rights and right to be able to work and to be able to sustain and support yourself. And I think beyond that, some of the areas that I've been involved with is sex worker rights and advocating for the rights of sex workers who are disproportionately oftentimes trans folks, but also trans people of color, oftentimes Latinx, and really seeing how harmful sometimes well-intentioned policies around criminalization of sex work, but oftentimes create so many harms to the people they are trying to purport to protect. And so really moving beyond like this kind of paternalistic model of trying to protect women or from exploitation, and realizing that people have autonomy and have their ability to make their own informed decisions and have choices over their own bodies. And so, and treating sex work as work. And so, I think these are a little bit more tangential, but I think these are areas where, I think where the most marginalized members of our community, this is their daily struggles and the things that they're dealing with. So I think, I had, advice to the next generation is like, think big, like really look holistically at all the different issues. Because I think, there's so many systemic problems that we need to fix. And I think beyond that, I think this is always repeated ad nauseum, but the Latinx community is not a monolith. Like, you have so many different communities from different countries of different ethnicities, and even within those countries, there's different backgrounds, indigenous backgrounds, and different languages, and all these things. And there's so many wide variety of backgrounds within it. And so I think emphasizing that diversity so that we aren't lumped in as one big monolithic community.
Thank you, Alejandra. Frank, you got 30.
Yeah, no, I'll be quick. Listen, I think the legal community, firms and legal groups can be more creative about how they are inclusive, about how they create support groups that involve intersectionality and not just traditional groups that can extend to programming and organizational development as well. And to the next generation, as I said, this generation has grown up in an unprecedented time of acceptance, and we expect a lot from you. You should use it because you have a gift. That's it.
Edward.
Sure. So I'll be quick too. I just listening to a podcast about a new book about ACT UP New York, and one thing that kind of struck me, which is it was a comment made about like you kind of add your part where you're at. Like there was I think one of the activists in ACT UP had gone to Yale, so he knew some of the individuals who worked in pharmaceutical companies. So they had a face-to-face meeting there, and then there was others who were more kind of in-your-face activists. But as a lawyer, I mean, there's so many different ways to support, positive change, whether it's like being lawyers for the on the street activists, or being, part of a federal agency, or being breaking a ceiling in a corporation. I mean, there are just a lot of ways, I think, to move forward.
Well, thank you. A special thanks to the ABA Commission on Hispanic Legal Rights and Responsibilities for putting this program together. All of our co-sponsors, our fantastic panelists, I thank you for your brave stories that you shared with us. And to all of our audience members who took the time to learn more about intersectionality and the Hispanic LGBTQ plus community. Betty, did you want to say any last words before we go?
I just want to echo what you just said. Thank you all so much for your great, really for this great panel, for sharing your expertise and sharing your stories.
Thank you. Have a great rest of the summer, everyone. Bye-bye.